The crates were sealed at midnight, and by morning, the maps were gone. Snow fell hard outside the archive in St. Petersburg. Inside, a small group of men stood in silence as wooden boxes were nailed shut. Each box carried old papers, fragile drawings, and maps so large they barely fit through the doors. One clerk whispered a question no one answered. Why erase them? Before dawn, the crates were moved. Before the week ended, the records disappeared. And by the end of the year, the word Tartaria began to fade from books, classrooms, and memory. What was being hidden and why? That question would echo for more than a century. Long before 1898, the name Northern Tartaria appeared on European maps again and again. It was not a small place. It covered vast lands across Siberia, Central Asia, and parts of what we now call Russia. Explorers wrote the name carefully. Cartographers printed it clearly. Libraries stored it openly. Then, suddenly, it vanished. Not through war, not through fire, but through silence. And tied to that silence was something even stranger. Stories of giant people. Not monsters, not myths of magic, but tall humans described in letters, journals, and early reports. People said to be far larger than average, living in remote northern lands. Most modern history books never mention these claims. But in the 1800s, many did. To understand how this began, we must go back. Way back. In the 1500s and 1600s, European travelers crossed into lands few outsiders had ever seen. They described endless forests, frozen rivers, and cities built from stone and wood, standing strong against brutal winters. They also described the people. Some were ordinary, others were not. One Dutch traveler wrote of villagers taller than any man in Amsterdam. A Jesuit record spoke of men whose armor had to be specially made. Russian officials wrote about prisoners from the north who did not fit standard cells. Were these exaggerations? Mistakes of fear and distance? Or something else? No one knew for sure, but the stories kept coming. By the 1700s, Northern Tartaria was still clearly marked on maps. Scholars debated its culture. Empires tried to control its trade routes. And quietly, museums collected remains from the region: bones, tools, clothing. Some bones were labeled unusual. Some were locked away. By the 1800s, science was changing fast. Measurements mattered. Classification mattered. And history was being rewritten to fit new ideas about progress, race, and civilization. Anything that did not fit neatly became a problem. And Northern Tartaria did not fit. Then came 1898, a year that looks ordinary on the surface. But deep inside archives across Europe and Russia, something changed. Libraries began updating atlases. Schools received new textbooks. Old maps were replaced. And one name was quietly removed. Tartaria. No announcement. No explanation. Just gone. At the same time, reports of unusual human remains began to disappear from public records. Museum catalogs were revised. Display cases were emptied. Some items were reclassified. Others were never mentioned again. A French archivist later wrote in his diary, "Certain collections were withdrawn without record. We were told they were errors, but no one explained the errors." In Germany, a librarian noted missing folios from a geography volume printed in 1723. In Britain, a map room assistant reported that a large wall map had been sent for correction and never returned. Corrections to what? Here is where the story slows and grows darker. Because the truth may not be about giants at all. It may be about control. In the late 1800s, empires were racing to define history in a clean, simple way. The world was being divided into nations, borders, and timelines. Complex regions with mixed cultures were inconvenient. Northern Tartaria was exactly that. It was vast, multi-ethnic, poorly understood, and difficult to rule. So history did what it often does. It simplified. The stories of giants may have been the result of many things. Malnutrition differences making travelers seem smaller, cultural clothing that added height, measurement systems that did not match a rare genetic conditions exaggerated by fear and rumor, but instead of explaining these possibilities, the records were erased. Why? Because once people began questioning the maps, they began questioning authority. And that was dangerous. By 1900, the word Tartaria was mostly gone. In its place were new regional names, new borders, new explanations. Students no longer asked who lived there before. Teachers no longer taught the old maps. And the strange reports were dismissed as fantasy. But the documents never fully vanished. Some survived in private collections. Some sat uncatalogued in archives. Some appeared briefly in early photographs, tall figures standing beside soldiers, their heads almost touching door frames. Are these proof? No, but they are questions. And history fears questions. One surviving map, dated 1897, shows Northern Tartaria clearly marked, just 1 year before its disappearance. In the margin, a handwritten note reads, "Reprint not advised." No reason given, just a warning. And then there is the final record. A shipment log from an archive dated December 1898. It lists several crates marked geographic revisions. One line at the bottom is different, written in smaller ink. Anthropological anomalies, restrict access. After that line, the page ends. The next page is missing. Whatever was inside those crates never returned to public view. No official denial was issued. No explanation was offered. And the idea of giants became a joke, an easy way to dismiss anyone who kept asking questions. Which may have been the point all along. Because if people laughed, they would stop looking. And if they stopped looking, no one would notice what else had been erased. Chapter 1 ends here, with a locked crate, a missing map, and a single question left behind in the snow-covered silence of 1898. What else did history decide we were never meant to see? When the new century arrived, history books looked cleaner. Too clean. In classrooms across Europe and Russia, children opened fresh atlases with sharp borders and neat names. Siberia, Central Asia, Russian Empire, Qing lands. Every region labeled, measured, explained. But one name was missing. No Tartaria. For students, this meant nothing. For scholars who had spent their lives studying old maps, it meant everything. Because maps do not forget by accident. In 1901, a quiet argument began in academic halls. It did not reach newspapers. It did not reach the public. But behind closed doors, historians compared notes. How can a region appear on hundreds of maps for 3 centuries, one professor asked, and then vanish without a treaty, a war, or a collapse? There was no answer, only discomfort. Old atlases were pulled from shelves for repair. Some never returned. Others came back with pages missing, margins trimmed, legends altered. Where the word Tartaria once stood, there was now empty space or a different label. It was not a rewrite. It was a fade. And fading is harder to notice than destruction. In a small university in Prague, a graduate student named Emil Novak found something strange. He was cataloging donated books when he noticed a pattern. Maps printed before 1800 showed Northern Tartaria clearly. Maps printed after 1900 did not. But maps printed between 1850 and 1890 showed something else. Edits. Borders drawn heavier. Names written smaller. Notes added in the corners. As if someone had been preparing the erasure. Novak followed the trail. He requested access to restricted collections. He read letters between cartographers. He found polite disagreements that suddenly ended. Scholars who once debated Tartaria stopped mentioning it entirely, as if they had agreed to forget, or been told to. In one letter from 1895, a senior geographer wrote to a colleague, "It is advised we adopt standardized regional terminology going forward. Older names may cause confusion." Confusion for whom? At the same time, anthropology was changing. Scientists were building new models of human history, timelines that moved neatly from primitive to modern. These models needed order. They needed averages. They needed rules. Anything that did not fit was labeled unreliable, including reports of unusual human size. The truth is simple and often ignored. Humans vary. Height changes with diet. Climate affects growth. Measurement tools differ by era. But in the 1700s and early 1800s, explorers lacked standard tools. They compared people to themselves, not to data. A tall population could become giants in writing, especially when fear and distance shaped the story. This does not require monsters. It requires misunderstanding. But instead of correcting the misunderstanding, the records were buried. Why? Because correcting them would require reopening the past. Museums faced a problem. They held remains that did not match averages. Skeletons taller than expected. Armor larger than standard issue. Doorways higher than common European design. None of this proves a lost race of giants. But it does prove diversity. And diversity complicates simple stories. So labels changed. A skeleton once described as exceptionally tall individual, origin unknown, became measurement error. A display once marked Northern Tartary was retagged Regional Siberia. Small changes. Quiet changes. By 1910, Emil Novak had collected enough evidence to raise concerns. He prepared a paper questioning the sudden disappearance of Tartaria from modern historiography. It was never published. The journal declined without explanation. A mentor advised him to choose a safer topic. And when Novak asked for access to certain archives again, he was told the materials had been relocated. To where? No one knew. The pressure was not violent. It did not need to be. Careers depend on cooperation. Grants depend on approval. Access depends on trust. And questioning official history threatened all three. Then came the photographs. Early photography was rare, expensive, and often staged. But a few images survived from northern expeditions in the mid-1800s. In them, people stood beside horses, carts, and soldiers. Some figures appeared unusually tall. Not impossibly tall, just enough to make viewers pause. Modern viewers might say, camera angle, perspective, uneven ground, all reasonable explanations. But the photos raise the same question as the maps. Why hide them? In 1913, a private collector in Vienna attempted to auction a set of maps labeled Grand Tartary. The auction was quietly canceled. The maps were bought before public viewing. By whom? The records do not say. History often teaches us to look for loud moments, battles, fires, revolutions. But the most powerful changes are silent. A word removed, a label replaced, a question discouraged. That is how memory is shaped. Northern Tartaria did not vanish overnight. It was edited out. And the stories of giants, whether true, exaggerated, or misunderstood, were useful distractions. They allowed skeptics to laugh instead of investigate. Because it is easier to dismiss a myth than to confront a pattern. By the time the First World War began, the old world was breaking apart. Empires fell, borders shifted, and whatever remained of Tartaria's memory was buried under new chaos. People had bigger fears now. No one asked about old maps. Except one person did. In 1920, while reorganizing war-damaged archives, a librarian found a sealed folder marked "Not for redistribution." Inside were copies of correspondence from the 1890s discussing geographic consistency and anthropological outliers. At the bottom of the folder was a memo. Public reference to Tartaria no longer necessary. No signature, just a date. 1896. The librarian never published the finding. The folder was resealed. And once again, the trail went cold. But the question refused to die. If Tartaria was nothing, why erase it? If the reports were wrong, why hide them instead of correcting them? If history was certain, why fear old maps? This scene closes not with proof, but with pressure. Pressure applied so gently that most never felt it. Pressure that reshaped history without breaking a single law. And as the world marched forward, convinced it knew its past, a final truth waited in the shadows. The greatest power is not the power to destroy history, but the power to decide which parts are remembered at all. And in a forgotten archive, one last map still waited to be opened. Have you ever heard of a silence so complete it can swallow a whole empire? Imagine a map, not a fantasy one, but an official document from 1742. It's been hidden away, folded in a drawer, sealed with cracked wax. An archivist finally opens it, and the air in the room just grows heavy. There, written clearly across the vast expanse of northern Asia, is a name, Tartaria. It's not a faded whisper, it's a statement. Rivers are named, cities are marked, and borders are drawn with absolute confidence. This wasn't a mistake. It was a record. The archivist who found it remains nameless, lost to the very history he was trying to preserve. But his notes survived. Just a few short lines, written almost with a sense of fear. Map dated 1742. Imperial origin. Geographic detail inconsistent with modern omission. He didn't need to explain what that meant. The silence that followed did all the talking. You see, by the early 20th century, history had picked its winners. The world was obsessed with progress, straight lines, and simple stories of rising and falling empires. A civilization like Tartaria didn't fit. It was messy. It wasn't one single nation with one single king. It was a complex tapestry of many cultures, living across a huge territory. And because it was complex, it was easy to erase. Think about the travel accounts from the 1600s and 1700s. They described these communities not as primitive, but as different. They had extensive trade routes, legal systems, and sophisticated engineering built for some of the world's harshest climates. They had rich oral traditions that carried their history. But because they were grouped under one umbrella term, Tartarian, it became convenient to just remove the umbrella. The individual cultures underneath vanished along with it. And what about the giants? The stories of massive beings that roamed these lands? The truth is a lot quieter, but also more interesting than the legend. Some populations were, on average, taller than Europeans. Some armor was built larger for ceremonial purposes or for bigger warriors. Some architecture was scaled differently for reasons we can only guess at. Over time, exaggeration twisted these simple differences into a full-blown myth of giants. And myths are useful. They give historians a perfect excuse. If you can make one part of the story sound unbelievable, you can dismiss the entire thing. That was the trick. The process of erasure was subtle. There was no grand announcement, no global memo that said, "We are now deleting Tartaria." It just happened, slowly and quietly. By the 1930s, old maps showing Tartaria were simply labeled outdated. The detailed reports from early travelers were called unreliable. Museums quietly updated their displays, replacing old artifacts with ones that fit the new, simplified narrative. No correction was ever issued. Silence did the work. It scrubbed the name from the pages of our shared past, leaving behind a void, a question mark hanging over the largest continent on Earth. It makes you wonder, what other stories have been silenced? What other maps are waiting in dusty drawers to be found? The story of Tartaria isn't just about a lost empire. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember. It's the stories we decide to tell, and, more importantly, the ones we decide to bury. Then came the war. Archives burned. Cities collapsed. Collections vanished. After World War II, much of Europe was rebuilding from rubble. Few people cared about old names on old maps. When the dust settled, a new world order stood in place. And Tartaria was not invited. Decades later, historians looking back found something unsettling. There was no clear moment when Tartaria ended. No treaty. No conquest. No collapse. It simply stopped being mentioned. That is not how history usually works. Today, fragments still surface. A map in a private collection. A mislabeled museum piece. A travel journal tucked inside an estate sale book. Each fragment raises the same question. If Tartaria never existed, why does it keep appearing? And if it did exist, why was forgetting it so important? The answer may not be dramatic. It may not be sinister. It may simply be human. History is written by systems, not just people. And systems prefer clarity over complexity. They smooth rough edges. They remove outliers. They tell stories that are easy to teach. Tartaria was not easy, so it was erased. The giants were not monsters. The maps were not lies. The truth sat somewhere in between, in misunderstood measurements, cultural bias, political convenience, and the quiet power of standardization. What vanished was not a race of giants. It was a name, a memory, a way of seeing the world that did not survive modernization. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. Not that history hides secrets, but that it forgets them on purpose. Because once something is forgotten long enough, it no longer needs to be hidden. It simply disappears, like Tartaria did, or so we are told.